The invitation arrived at her apartment at 3:17 in the afternoon, slid halfway under a door that barely closed anymore. The envelope was thick, cream paper, embossed seal, the kind people used when they wanted something to feel important or permanent. Maggie Collins stared at it from across the room and didn't move. Outside, a garbage truck growled down the street, metal grinding against metal, the sound echoing between brick buildings. Inside the apartment, smelled faintly of cold coffee and engine oil. Her boots were still on. Mud dried along the soles. She hadn't planned to be home yet. The name on the envelope was written neatly. Margaret Collins. No nickname, no smiley flourish. Just the name she'd stopped hearing out loud a long time ago. She already knew what it was. Her phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. A single vibration. Then silence. She didn't look at it. 10 years. 10 years since Ridgeway High. 10 years since she'd walked out the side door of the gym after graduation, while everyone else crowded the front steps, laughing, hugging parents, snapping photos. She remembered the sound of applause fading behind her. The air outside had been hot. Still. Final. She crossed the room and picked up the envelope. The paper was heavier than it needed to be, like it was compensating for something. Inside the card unfolded cleanly. No creases, no fingerprints. The words were cheerful in a careful, practiced way. Ridgeway High Class Reunion, 10-year gathering, Veterans Memorial Hall, downtown. Her eyes paused on the date, on the time, on the line that said RSVP requested. At the bottom, a handwritten note. Just one sentence. Hope you can make it. It would be great to see everyone together again. She smiled once. Brief. Humorless. Great for who? Her phone buzzed again. This time she answered. Collins, she said. A man's voice came through calm but tight. Lieutenant Collins. This is operations. We need you back at base by 2000 hours. Understood, Maggie said. No hesitation. No explanation. She hung up and set the phone down. Then she folded the invitation slowly and placed it on the counter. She didn't throw it away. She didn't put it in a drawer. She left it where she could see it, because somewhere in another part of town the same invitation was being discussed very differently. Daniel Harper leaned back in his chair and spun the envelope between his fingers, tapping it lightly against the glass desk. His office overlooked Main Street, 3 floors up, where new restaurants replaced old hardware stores, and everyone pretended that meant progress. She still lives here, he said, half to himself. Across from him, Laura Simmons adjusted the sleeve of her blazer and glanced at her phone. She hadn't looked up when Daniel spoke. Of course she does, she said. People like that don't really leave. They just disappear. Brian Keller snorted from the corner where he stood pouring himself coffee from a machine that cost more than Maggie's car. You think she'll come? Mark Evans shrugged eyes on the window. Why wouldn't she? It's a reunion. Everyone comes to these things. Curiosity gets them. Daniel smiled. Not wide, just enough. I barely remember her, he said. Laura finally looked up. Her lips curved slightly. I remember she never talked, never dated, always watching, like she was somewhere else. Brian laughed softly. I remember she cried once, in sophomore year, outside the science wing. No, she didn't, Mark said. Brian lifted his shoulders. She looked like she was about to. Same thing. They fell quiet for a moment. Outside, a siren wailed and faded. Daniel placed the envelope on the desk, flattening it with his palm. It's been 10 years, he said. Feels like a lifetime. Some people peak early, Laura said. Some never peak at all. Daniel's smile lingered. Well, he said if she shows up good for her. None of them said what they were thinking. They didn't need to. Across town, Maggie pulled her jacket back on and paused by the mirror. The glass was cracked at the corner, spider webbing outward. Her reflection fractured slightly, but her eyes stayed steady. She looked older than 28. Not in years, in weight. Her hair was pulled back tight, no loose strands. Her face was lean, sharp at the edges. There was a faint bruise along her wrist, yellowing now. Old enough not to hurt. New enough to remember. She reached for her keys, then stopped. The invitation sat on the counter. Silent. Patient. 10 years ago, she would have laughed and thrown it away. 10 years ago, she would have assumed it was a joke or a mistake. Now she picked it up again. At Veterans Memorial Hall, volunteers were already setting up folding chairs. The building smelled like old wood and lemon cleaner. Flags lined the walls. Photographs of men and women in uniform stared down from faded frames. Frank Miller adjusted the microphone at the front of the room and frowned when it squealed. He tapped it once hard. The sound snapped clean. "Testing," he said. "Testing." His voice carried. It always had. Even now at 68, with a knee that ached and a back that complained, every morning he stood straight. Habit. Training. A woman near the door smiled at him. "Sounds good, Frank." He nodded and glanced at the sign-in table. "We expecting a big crowd?" She shrugged. "Same as always. Some familiar faces, some ghosts." Frank looked at the banner stretched across the far wall. Ridgeway High. 10-year reunion. He remembered those kids. Not all of them, but some. His gaze drifted to the door, for no reason he could name. Back in her car, Maggie sat in silence, engine idling. The invitation lay on the passenger seat, fluttering slightly with the air from the vent. She didn't know yet if she would go. But somewhere deep in her chest, something old had shifted. Not anger, not hope, attention. And attention she knew was dangerous. By 6:40 in the evening, Veterans Memorial Hall had filled with the low murmur of polite conversation and the scrape of chairs against the floor. Coats hung on the backs of seats. Glasses clinked softly. Someone laughed too loud, then apologized. The air carried the mixed smells of cologne perfume and reheated catered food. Daniel Harper stood near the center of the room, one hand in his pocket, the other holding a plastic cup of beer he barely drank. He moved easily from group to group, nodding, smiling, saying the right names at the right times. Realtor habits, eye contact, reassurance, control. Every few minutes, his gaze drifted to the entrance without him realizing it. Laura Simmons hovered near the photo table, flipping through a binder of old yearbook pages. She laughed when she was supposed to. She tilted her head just enough to look interested. Her phone stayed face down in her purse, though her fingers kept brushing the strap, itching. Brian Keller leaned against the wall near the refreshments jacket, off sleeves rolled up like he had something to prove. He watched people more than he spoke. His eyes flicked to the door, then away, then back again. He told himself it meant nothing. Mark Evans arrived late and slid quietly into the room, blending into the noise. He nodded at Daniel, took a drink, and positioned himself where he could see the whole hall without being seen too much himself. He had always liked angles, lines of sight, knowing where exits were. At the front, Frank Miller stepped away from the microphone and let the crowd settle on its own. He recognized faces in fragments, smiles without names, names without stories. He noticed who avoided the photos on the wall. He noticed who lingered. The slideshow started without announcement. Black and white images at first. Football games, pep rallies, class photos, faces younger, softer. Laughter rippled lightly through the room. Someone pointed. Someone groaned. Someone said they had forgotten how bad their hair had been. When Maggie Collins appeared on the screen, it was brief. A group shot from sophomore year. She stood at the edge, half turned away, eyes not quite on the camera. A few people frowned, trying to place her. A couple whispered. One person chuckled, then stopped when no one joined. The image moved on. Laura exhaled without realizing she had been holding her breath. Daniel took a sip of his beer and tasted nothing. Brian looked at the floor. Time passed. By 7:15, small talk deepened into comparison. Jobs, houses, kids. Divorces said casually like weather, the kind of conversation people practiced so they would not have to talk about anything real. Frank noticed the door again when it opened. Not because of noise, because of posture. Maggie stepped inside and paused just long enough to let her eyes adjust. The room was brighter than outside, warmer. She took in the space in a single sweep. Exits, corners, faces. No surprise registered on her face. No hesitation. She wore a dark service uniform, clean pressed, unadorned. No medals. No shine. Her boots were polished but practical. Her hair was secured tight at the back of her head. Her shoulders were squared, relaxed, like someone who knew exactly how much space she occupied. Conversation faltered in waves. Not silence. Something stranger. A thinning. Daniel noticed her first. He straightened instinctively, smoothing the front of his jacket. For a second, he didn't recognize her. Then he did, and his stomach dropped just enough to matter. Laura's eyes widened, then narrowed. She tilted her head, studying Maggie's uniform, the way people did when they tried to decode something without asking. Her smile froze, then softened into something careful. Brian set his cup down slowly. His jaw tightened. He felt an urge to say something, anything, and did not know why. Mark felt it too. A pressure behind the ribs. Recognition without memory. He watched Maggie walk past him. Her steps measured her gaze level, and he understood, dimly, that something in the room had shifted direction. Frank Miller straightened. His eyes went immediately to Maggie's shoulder, to the patch, to the stitching. He inhaled sharply through his nose. She moved through the crowd without touching anyone, yet people stepped aside. Not consciously. It was reflex. Space opened where she walked. Someone whispered her name. Not loudly. Not proudly. Like testing a word that might still have weight. Maggie stopped near the sign in table. She reached for the pen, signed her name, and capped it again with precise movements. Her handwriting was steady. No flourish. No apology. Frank crossed the room before he could talk himself out of it. His knee protested, but he ignored it. He stopped a few feet from her and waited until she looked up. "Margaret Collins," he said, voice even. "You came." "Yes, sir," Maggie replied. She nodded once, respectful, neutral. His eyes flicked again to her uniform. He swallowed. "You look well." She allowed a small pause. "Thank you." Daniel approached, then, smile already in place, hand extended. Maggie Wright, Daniel Harper. We were in history together. She looked at his hand, then at his face. A flicker of recognition crossed her eyes. Not warmth, not resentment. Awareness. "Daniel," she said and shook his hand. Firm. "Brief." She released first. "Didn't know you were in the service," he said, forcing a light tone. "I am," she replied. Laura joined them, laughter, arriving half a beat too late. "Wow, look at you. We had no idea." Maggie turned to face her. "I didn't send updates." Brian hovered behind Laura, eyes darting between faces, so he said too quickly. "You stationed nearby, for now," Maggie said. Frank watched their faces. He saw the questions forming, the assumptions. He cleared his throat. "Margaret here flies Apache," he said. "Out of the guard base west of the city." The word landed heavy. Apache. Silence followed. Not complete, but stunned. Laura's smile slipped. Daniel's eyebrows rose before he caught himself. Brian blinked hard. Mark leaned forward slightly. "Apache," he repeated. Not disbelief. Calculation. Maggie did not confirm or deny. She did not elaborate. She stood still and let the air settle. Someone near the back murmured, "Damn." Frank folded his hands behind his back. "She's been busy." Daniel laughed, sharp and short. "Guess we all chose different paths." Maggie met his eyes. "We did." Her phone buzzed once in her pocket. She ignored it. Around them, conversation resumed, but differently now. Softer. Measured. People watched Maggie when they thought she wasn't looking. Some with admiration. Some with unease. A few with something like regret. She felt it all. Let it pass through without lodging. Years had taught her how. Laura touched her arm lightly. "You staying long?" Maggie glanced at the door. Then back. "Not too long." Daniel nodded. "Still, glad you came." Maggie studied his face for a moment longer than necessary. "I am too." Frank caught her eye again. He gave a small nod. Approval? Recognition? She returned it. Outside, somewhere beyond the walls, a distant thump rolled through the air. Faint, rhythmic, almost like a heartbeat carried on the wind. Several heads turned at once. Maggie did not look up. Not yet. Her phone buzzed again. This time she felt it. The sound returned deeper this time, a low rhythmic pulse that pressed against the walls of Veterans Memorial Hall like a distant tide. Thump. Thump, not loud enough to panic anyone, just loud enough to unsettle. Conversations thinned again. Glasses paused halfway to mouths. Someone near the windows frowned and tilted their head. "What is that?" Laura whispered, not to anyone in particular. Frank Miller closed his eyes for a half-second, listening. When he opened them, his expression had changed. Recognition edged with concern. "That's not traffic," he said, quietly. Daniel forced a laugh. "Probably a medevac passing through," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. Maggie felt the vibration through the floor before she heard it again. Years of habit. Her shoulders tensed slightly, then relaxed. Her eyes moved, tracking without appearing to. She took a step toward the windows and stopped. She didn't need to see it yet. Her phone buzzed. Once. Then again. She reached into her pocket and read the message without changing her expression. On standby. 10 minutes. She typed a single word back. Copy. Brian noticed her fingers moving. "Everything okay?" he asked, trying to sound casual. "Yes," Maggie said. She slipped the phone away. Just timing. Mark watched her closely now. He had the uneasy feeling of being in the presence of something he didn't fully understand, like standing too close to a machine with no guardrails. The slideshow ended, and the lights brightened slightly. Someone clapped, unsure why. Frank stepped toward the microphone again, intending to say something grounding familiar. Before he could speak, the sound outside grew stronger. Thump. Thump. The windows rattled faintly. A woman near the back laughed nervously. "Is this part of the program?" she asked. Frank didn't answer. He was staring at Maggie. She met his gaze and gave the smallest shake of her head. Not yet. Outside, a gust of wind swept across the parking lot, kicking dust into the air. Leaves skittered along the pavement. A few people moved closer to the windows now, curiosity overriding politeness. Daniel followed them, peering out. His breath caught. "You've got to be kidding me." A shape cut across the darkening sky, low and deliberate. Not landing, circling. The rotors beat the air with controlled force, a sound that settled into the bones. An Apache, unmistakable in silhouette banking, just enough for its lights to flash across the building. A collective intake of breath rippled through the room. "Oh my God," Laura whispered. Phones came out. Instinctively. Not all at once. A few at first. Then more. Screens glowed as people pressed closer to the glass. "It's not landing," Mark said, stating the obvious. "No," Maggie said softly. "It won't." The helicopter passed once more, then angled away, the sound receding but not disappearing. The air inside the hall felt charged now, like a storm that had brushed past without touching ground. Silence followed. Thick, uncertain. Daniel turned slowly back toward Maggie. That was he started, then stopped. He laughed again, too loud. That was something. Maggie looked at him. Yes. Laura folded her arms, suddenly self-conscious. "You didn't tell anyone," she said. "It wasn't an accusation." "Not quite. More a realization." "I wasn't asked," Maggie replied. Frank stepped forward, voice steady but firm. "All right," he said. "Let's all take a breath. This is still a reunion." A few people nodded. A few smiled weakly. The room tried to settle, but the sound had done its work. Something had been introduced that couldn't be unintroduced. Daniel leaned closer to Maggie. So he said, lowering his voice, "You fly one of those?" "Yes. For real," Brian added, disbelief creeping in. "Like combat." Maggie held his gaze. "Yes." Brian swallowed. "Damn." Mark cleared his throat. "Where were you stationed?" he asked carefully. "Places," Maggie said. Laura frowned. "You always were private." Maggie considered that. "I learned it." Frank watched the exchange, noting the subtle shift in posture, the way Maggie never leaned back, never filled space unnecessarily. He recognized it now. The bearing, the restraint. He had worn it once himself, a lifetime ago. A man near the refreshment table spoke up. "So what brings you back?" he asked, trying to sound friendly. "Nostalgia." Maggie turned toward him. "No." The bluntness startled a few laughs out of people. She didn't smile. "I came because I was invited," she continued, "and because sometimes it's worth seeing what time changes. And what it doesn't." Daniel felt heat creep up his neck. "We're glad you're here," he said quickly. Maggie studied him again, this time longer. She saw the calculation behind his eyes, the curiosity, the relief that she wasn't angry. Yet. "Thank you," she said. Her phone buzzed, a different pattern. 3 short vibrations. Frank noticed. "You need to take that," he said, quietly. "Yes," Maggie replied. She stepped away from the group, moving toward the side corridor that led to the offices. Conversations resumed behind her, but now they were about her. Low. Speculative. "Did you know someone?" whispered. "No idea. She looks different. Always did." In the hallway, Maggie answered the phone. Collins. A familiar voice came through clipped professional. "We're holding. Change of plan." Maggie closed her eyes for a brief moment. "Understood." "Be advised," the voice continued. Media picked up the flyover. Maggie exhaled slowly. "Figures." "Your call, Lieutenant," the voice said. "But once this moves, it won't stop." Maggie ended the call and leaned her forehead lightly against the cool wall, just for a second. Then she straightened. Back in the hall, Daniel was talking too much, filling space. She was always quiet, he said to no one. Guess she found her thing. Laura nodded. Good for her. Brian shifted uncomfortably. I feel like we should have known. Mark shook his head. We didn't look. Frank stood alone, near the microphone hands, clasped, watching Maggie re-enter the room. He saw something in her eyes now. A decision settling. She stopped near the center of the hall. Didn't raise her voice. Didn't ask for attention. But it came anyway. I need to step out shortly, she said loud enough to carry. Before I do, I want to say one thing. The room stilled. I know what some of you remember about me, Maggie continued. And what you don't, that's fine. We were young. We were busy surviving our own stories. Daniel shifted. Laura's mouth tightened. Brian looked at the floor. I didn't come back to correct anyone, Maggie said. Or to impress. I came because I wanted to see if silence still meant the same thing it used to. She paused. Letting that land. It doesn't, she said. Not anymore. Her phone buzzed again. Insistent. Outside, far off but unmistakable, the rotors returned. Louder now. Closer. Frank felt his pulse quicken. He knew that sound. He knew what followed. Maggie turned toward the doors. This time she didn't hesitate. The doors swung open under the pressure of wind before anyone touched them. A sharp gust, tearing through the hall and carrying the smell of jet fuel and cold night air inside. Papers lifted from tables. A banner snapped against the wall. Someone shouted, half laugh, half fear. The sound outside was no longer distant. It was here. Thump, thump, thump. The rotors didn't scream. They commanded. Each rotation pressed the air flat, heavy, as if the sky itself were leaning down to listen. Maggie stepped forward into the doorway and stopped just inside the threshold. She did not shield her face. She did not flinch. Her boots planted weight evenly distributed, like she was bracing against something that had nothing to do with weather. Daniel reached her side without realizing he was moving. "This is insane," he said. "Is that for you?" She didn't look at him. "No," she said. "It's bigger than me." Outside headlights swept across the parking lot. A military motorcade rolled in tires, crunching gravel engines, idling low and controlled. No sirens, no chaos. Precision, the kind that came from practice, not urgency. Phones rose higher now. No one told them to. People recorded because they didn't know what else to do with their hands. Laura whispered, "Oh my God." Again, softer this time, like a prayer. Frank moved to Maggie's other side. "You didn't plan this," he said. "It wasn't a question." "No," Maggie replied, "but I knew it might happen." The first vehicle stopped. A door opened. A man stepped out. Tall, broad-shouldered, grey hair, cut close posture, unmistakable. He wore a dark coat over civilian clothes, but the way he moved marked him as military long before anyone saw his ID. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Someone near the back said his name, barely audible. Someone else shook their head, disbelieving. Mark felt the shift before he understood it. The sense that this wasn't about spectacle anymore. This was structure revealing itself. The man approached the entrance and stopped a few feet from Maggie. He studied her face, then nodded once. "Respect not familiarity." "Lieutenant Collins," he said. "Yes, sir," Maggie replied. "I'm Colonel Harris," he said, voice carrying without effort. "We need you." Daniel's stomach dropped. Laura's breath caught. Brian's hands clenched at his sides. Frank straightened. He knew that tone. He had heard it once, decades ago, when everything else fell away. Maggie didn't move. "I understand," she said. 5 minutes. Colonel Harris hesitated, then nodded. 5. He stepped back, turning to speak quietly into a radio. The rotors outside continued their measured beat, relentless and patient. Inside the hall, no one spoke. The silence was not polite now. It was reverent, uncomfortable, exposed. Daniel broke it. First, his voice thin. "Maggie," he said. "What's going on?" She turned to face him fully. Her expression was calm, but there was something sharpened underneath now. Focus. Resolve. "I can't explain details," she said. "But I need you to listen." He nodded quickly. Too quickly. Laura leaned closer eyes, searching Maggie's face for something familiar. Brian took a step back, like he'd wandered too close to a fire. This town, Maggie, continued sits near infrastructure. People don't think about. Training corridors, transit routes, things that only matter when they matter. Mark frowned. "You mean like tonight?" "Yes." Frank's voice was steady. "Is anyone in danger?" Maggie met his eyes. "Held them. Not if we do this right." The words landed heavy. A woman near the refreshments began to cry quietly. Someone else put an arm around her. The room felt smaller now, the walls closer. Daniel swallowed. "And the reunion," he said, gesturing vaguely. This was just coincidence. Maggie's lips pressed together for a moment. "Nothing is just coincidence," she said, but this wasn't about embarrassing anyone. "Not tonight." Laura flushed. "We weren't trying to," she started. Maggie raised a hand. Not harsh. Final. Laura stopped speaking. "I came here because I was invited," Maggie said. "I stayed because I needed to see something for myself." What Brian asked hoarsely. Maggie looked around the room. Faces she remembered in pieces. Others she didn't. People who had built lives, lost them, rebuilt again. People who had looked through her once, and were now looking at her like she was something fragile and dangerous at the same time. "I needed to know if people could still listen," she said. "If they could still stand still when it mattered." The rotors outside shifted pitch. A signal. Time compressing. Colonel Harris glanced at his watch. Frank stepped forward. "Whatever you're carrying," he said, "you don't have to carry it alone." Maggie's gaze softened for a fraction of a second. "Thank you," she said. Then it hardened again. Purpose returning. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a folded card. The reunion invitation. She placed it on the table nearest the door. "I appreciate the thought," she said. Truly. Daniel stared at the card like it had teeth. Maggie turned back toward the entrance. "I have to go." Laura stepped forward, impulsive. "Will we see you again?" Maggie paused. The question hung there, naked. "I don't know," she said honestly. "That depends on what happens next." Outside, the wind surged again as the rotors dipped, adjusting. The air inside vibrated, rattling the framed photos on the wall. One fell slightly crooked. Frank reached out and straightened it without looking. Maggie took 2 steps toward the door, then stopped. She turned back one last time. "For what it's worth," she said, voice level but carrying, "I never needed anyone here to believe in me. I needed you not to underestimate what quiet people are capable of." No one argued. No one laughed. Colonel Harris opened the door wider. The night rushed in. Maggie stepped through her silhouette, framed against the lights outside, sharp and unmistakable. The crowd followed her to the threshold, but did not cross it. Some lines were clear, even without tape. She didn't look back. As the doors closed behind her, the sound swallowed the room. Thump, 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 rising, commanding. Inside, Veterans Memorial Hall stood frozen full of people who suddenly understood that the world they lived in was larger, sharper, and far less forgiving than they had assumed. And somewhere beyond the walls, Maggie Collins was already moving toward something that would not wait, The helicopter's shadow slid across the asphalt as Maggie crossed the parking lot, the air vibrating against her ribs with each controlled rotation of the blades. Gravel stung her ankles. The night smelled of fuel and damp leaves. She didn't look up. She didn't need to. Every step was counted, measured, already lived in muscle memory. Colonel Harris walked beside her, matching her pace. "We're on a tight clock," he said, voice raised just enough to cut through the noise. Unidentified movement along the western corridor. Civilian traffic too close for comfort. Maggie nodded once. "Rules of engagement. Restrictive," he replied. As always. They reached the lead vehicle. A door opened. Inside, maps glowed blue and red under dim lights. A young officer looked up, eyes sharp, jaw tight. "Lieutenant Collins on deck," he said, more announcement than greeting. Maggie climbed in and took the tablet offered to her. The screen showed a live feed, jittering slightly. Terrain she knew, roads she had flown over in daylight and darkness. Tonight the margins were thinner. "Civilian presence," she said, scanning. "We divert airspace. We tried," the officer said. "Media helicopters sniffing around after the flyover." Maggie exhaled through her nose. "Then we make them irrelevant." The vehicle lurched forward. Outside the reunion hall shrank behind them, lights still glowing, people still standing where she had left them. She felt a pull there, brief and distant, like a tide tugging at an anchored ship. Then it was gone. Inside Veterans Memorial Hall, the doors finally closed, sealing out the noise. The sudden quiet felt unnatural. People stood in clusters, unsure where to put their hands, their eyes. Daniel Harper stared at the empty doorway, as if expecting Maggie to reappear and explain everything. Laura broke the silence. "Did that actually just happen?" Brian laughed, once brittle. "I think it did." Mark rubbed his palms together. "That wasn't a stunt." "No," Frank Miller said. He had not moved from his place near the door. "That was real." A woman near the back sank into a chair. "I thought this was just a reunion." Frank turned slowly. "So did she," he said. "Until it wasn't." Daniel's voice dropped. "You knew," he said to Frank. "Not accusation. Recognition." Frank nodded. "I recognized the bearing. The patch. You don't forget certain things." Laura hugged herself. She didn't say she was like that. Frank met her gaze. She didn't owe anyone an explanation. The slideshow screen flickered forgotten. An image froze there. Maggie at 16, standing at the edge of a group eyes distant. Daniel looked at it now and felt something tighten in his chest. "We missed it," he said quietly. Brian frowned. "Missed what her?" Daniel replied. "All of it." Outside the city, the helicopter lifted cleanly, banking into the night. Maggie strapped in headset, on eyes forward. The pilot's voice came through steady. "Altitude stable. Awaiting your mark." Maggie keyed her mic. "Hold pattern. We wait for clearance." Below them, headlights traced thin lines along the highway. Too many. Too close. Her phone buzzed against her thigh, a secure line this time. She answered without looking away. "Collins, Lieutenant," a new voice said. "Female. Controlled. We're escalating. Civil authority notified." Maggie closed her eyes for half a second. "Then we thread the needle." "You're comfortable with that," the voice said. "I'm trained for it," Maggie replied. "Comfort doesn't enter into it." The line went dead. The helicopter tilted, adjusting. The world outside narrowed to essentials: distance, speed, timing. The rising tempo settled into something sharp and focused. This was where she belonged, not because it was safe, because it was necessary. Back at the hall, people began to drift. Not all at once. In twos and threes, conversations hushed. The night felt different now, heavier with unspoken things. Daniel stood by the sign-in table, staring at Maggie's signature. He traced the ink with his finger, not touching it like he might erase it by accident. Laura approached him. "I don't feel like celebrating anymore," she said. He nodded. "Me neither." "What do we do now?" she asked. Daniel looked around the room, at the photos, the flags. Frank standing alone near the microphone. "I don't know," he said. "But I think we just got reminded how small our stories are." Frank overheard and turned. "Small stories matter," he said. "They just shouldn't blind you to bigger ones." Brian shoved his hands into his pockets. "You think she'll be okay?" Frank considered the question. "I think she's exactly where she's supposed to be." In the air, Maggie leaned forward as the pilot announced clearance. "Windows opening." She nodded. "Take it." The helicopter surged ahead, rotors biting into the night. The lights of the city fell away. Ahead, darkness waited, layered and complex. Maggie felt the familiar narrowing of the world. No past, no reunion, no quiet judgments or late realizations. Just the next decision, the next correction. The weight of responsibility settling where it belonged. Her voice cut through the cockpit. "Eyes up." "We go now." The helicopter vanished into the dark, leaving behind a town that would talk about that night for years, and a roomful of people who would never look at silence the same way again. The first warning light blinked, amber, steady and unforgiving, as the helicopter crossed the outer edge of the corridor. Maggie didn't look at it. She felt the change instead, a subtle resistance in the air, like the sky tightening its grip. The pilot adjusted trim without being told. They had flown together long enough to anticipate each other's thoughts. "Civilian aircraft at 2:00, the co-pilot said. "News chopper. They're drifting." Maggie leaned forward, eyes fixed on the dark horizon. "They'll drift more," she said. "They always do." Below them, the highway curved through low hills, traffic thinning as the city lights fell away. Somewhere down there, people were driving home, arguing about dinner, thinking about tomorrow. None of them knew how close the margins were getting. The radio crackled. "Command to Collins. You're cleared to engage Protocol Grey." "Repeat, Protocol Grey." Maggie closed her eyes for half a breath. Grey meant choice. It meant there was no perfect answer waiting in a binder. "Copy," she said. "We'll manage it." The pilot glanced at her. "You sure about this altitude? I'm sure about the consequences," Maggie replied. "Stay with me." Inside Veterans Memorial Hall, the room was nearly empty now. Chairs sat crooked. Cups were abandoned, half full. The banner sagged slightly at one corner where the tape had loosened. Frank Miller moved methodically, stacking programs, straightening what he could. It gave his hands something to do. Daniel lingered by the door jacket, still on keys, clenched in his fist. He watched Frank work the quiet, stretching between them. "She didn't come back for us?" he said finally. Frank didn't look up. "No." Daniel swallowed. "I think part of me thought she would." Frank set a stack of papers down and turned. "That's because you're used to stories circling back to make you comfortable." Daniel winced. "That obvious yes," Frank said. Not unkindly. Most people don't notice the center of gravity shifting until it pulls something out of their hands. Laura hovered near the exit arms, crossed tightly. "I can't stop thinking about her face," she said. Not angry, not proud, just settled. "That's experience," Frank replied. "You don't get it from winning arguments." Outside, the night air was still again, as if nothing had happened. But the town felt changed, like a fault line had shifted somewhere under the streets. In the helicopter, the amber light flicked to red. A sharper tone cut through the headset. Thermal spike, the co-pilot said. Low altitude. Could be nothing. Or could be everything, Maggie said. She reached for the controls, fingers steady. Mark it. The screen filled with data lines converging, narrowing the uncertainty. Her jaw tightened slightly. This wasn't a drill. It never was. Command, she said into the mic. We're adjusting course. Civilian traffic too close. We need airspace cleared now. A pause. Too long. Command acknowledges, came the reply. But you're out of time. Maggie felt the weight of that sentence settle in her chest. Out of time meant someone else had already made a mistake. Or was about to. Pilot, she said. Bring us lower. Mask behind the ridge. The helicopter dipped, hugging the terrain. Trees rushed past beneath them, a dark blur. The news chopper drifted overhead, oblivious its spotlight sweeping uselessly across empty ground. Too close, the co-pilot muttered. Not close enough, Maggie replied. Her phone buzzed against her leg, an unsecure vibration she hadn't expected. She ignored it. Then it buzzed again, insistent. Wrong. She glanced down. An unknown number. Local. She answered. Collins. Maggie Daniels' voice came through breathless, uneven. I know I shouldn't be calling. Frank gave me your number. Are you okay? For a split second, the past tried to intrude. The gym hallway, the library table, a boy who never looked her in the eye until now. I can't talk, Maggie said. You shouldn't have this line. I know, Daniel said quickly. I just needed to say, the helicopter lurched slightly as the pilot corrected. Maggie closed her eyes for a fraction of a second. Daniel, she said, voice firm. Listen to me. Whatever happens tonight, it's not about closure. It's about responsibility. Go home. Silence on the line. I'm glad you came, Daniel said quietly. Maggie ended the call. Her phone went dark. She slipped it back into her pocket, heart rate steady again. Some doors could only be closed once. Problem, the co-pilot said. Movement ahead. That's not on any manifest. Maggie leaned forward. The screen sharpened. A heat signature pulsed, where it shouldn't, too deliberate, too contained. She felt the decision crystallize hard and clear. Command, she said. We have confirmation. This isn't a false positive. The reply came immediately, no tension, stripped bare. Understood. You're authorized. Authorized meant burden transferred. History written in seconds. Maggie inhaled slowly. Pilot, hold steady. We don't rush this. Yes, ma'am. Inside the helicopter, the noise faded into background. Training took over. Her world narrowed again to vectors and probabilities. She thought briefly of the hall, of Frank's eyes, of Daniel's voice breaking over a line he shouldn't have had. Then she let it go. In the city, Frank locked the doors of Veterans Memorial Hall and stood alone on the steps. He looked up at the empty sky hands in his coat pockets. He didn't pray. He didn't know how anymore. But he stood there anyway, bearing witness to something he couldn't see. A distant sound rolled across the hills. Not loud, not close, but unmistakable. Frank closed his eyes. Back in the cockpit, Maggie's voice cut clean through the channel. All units execute. We end this before it reaches anyone else. The helicopter surged forward, rotors biting hard, decisive. Below them, the darkness shifted, reacting. Whatever had been set in motion was about to be stopped. And Maggie Collins, once invisible, once overlooked, held the line between a quiet town and a night that would have torn it open. The ridge fell away beneath them, revealing a narrow valley, cut by an access road that shouldn't have been active at this hour. Maggie saw it instantly. 2 vehicles, no headlights, engines hot, moving with purpose, not speed, the kind of movement that assumed no one was watching. Confirm targets, she said. Confirmed, the co-pilot replied. No transponders. No registration. Civilians don't move like that, the pilot added. No, Maggie said. They don't. The helicopter slowed, holding position just beyond the ridgeline. The world outside was reduced to shapes and heat and intention. Maggie's breathing stayed even. Her hands rested lightly on the edge of the console, steady as stone. Command, she said. We have visual, 2 ground assets, likely attempting to bypass checkpoint grid. A beat. Then understood. You are primary. Primary meant there would be no one else to correct her if she was wrong. She nodded once, though no one could see it. We proceed with containment. No escalation unless forced. Copy, the pilot said. Holding. Below them, one of the vehicles slowed, then stopped. Doors opened. Heat signatures multiplied. 4, no 5. 1 stayed back. Overwatch. Maggie's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. They're organized. Could be contractors, the co-pilot said. Contractors don't hide, Maggie replied. And they don't avoid lights. Her radio crackled. Command to Collins. Be advised, state patrol units are 30 minutes out. You're alone. Alone. The word settled without weight. She had been alone before. Alone was manageable. Then we buy time, she said. Inside the helicopter, the lights dimmed slightly as systems shifted. The pilot adjusted position, sliding laterally to keep the ridge between them and the valley. Maggie leaned closer to the screen, tracking movement with practiced calm. One of the figures below raised an arm. A signal. The second vehicle repositioned, angling toward the tree line. They're splitting, the co-pilot said. Predictable, Maggie replied. They think they're unseen. She keyed the mic. All stations, this is Collins. We hold. We observe. We don't announce. The helicopter remained silent, a shadow above shadows. Back in town, Daniel sat in his car with the engine off hands, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles ached. He stared at the dark windshield, replaying Maggie's voice in his head. Go home. Responsibility. Not closure. He rested his forehead against the wheel and exhaled. For the first time in years, he felt small, not humiliated, not diminished, just properly sized. He started the car and pulled away from the curb. At Veterans Memorial Hall, Frank stood on the steps longer than he needed to. The distant sound he'd heard earlier didn't return, but the silence felt charged now, like the pause before a verdict. He checked his watch, then looked back up at the sky. Come back safe, he said aloud, not sure who he was talking to. In the valley, one of the figures tripped, just for a second. A misstep. Maggie saw it and felt the tension spike. People who moved carefully didn't stumble unless something went wrong. Pilot, she said. Bring us forward. Slow. Controlled. The helicopter eased ahead, cresting the ridge just enough for the camera to catch a clearer image. The heat signatures sharpened. Maggie's eyes narrowed. There, she said. See the carry, the co-pilot zoomed. A long, narrow object slung between 2 of the figures. Shielded. Heavy. Not civilian, he said. No, Maggie agreed. And not patient. The radio came alive again. Command to Collins. Satellite confirms unauthorized transport. You are cleared to interdict. Maggie inhaled. Held it. Released. Pilot, she said. Lights on. Now. The helicopter surged forward, landing lights cutting through the darkness like a blade. The valley lit up in stark white. Figures below froze, startled heads snapping upward. One of them raised a weapon. Too slow. Warning pass, Maggie ordered. Low. No fire. The helicopter dipped, roaring overhead, the force of its passage flattening grass and sending debris spiraling. The figures scattered, shouting their formation, braking instantly. "Contact," the co-pilot said. "They're running." "Of course they are," Maggie replied. "They didn't plan on witnesses." She leaned into the mic. "Ground units, you are observed. This is United States military air support. Drop your equipment and remain where you are." Her voice carried amplified absolute. Below, 2 figures stopped. One didn't. "He's bolting," the pilot said. Maggie's eyes tracked the fleeing heat signature. Fast, desperate. He's not making it far. The figure reached the tree line and vanished into cover. Maggie felt the margins tighten again. Trees meant risk. Shadows. Unknowns. "Pilot hold altitude," she said. "We don't chase blind." A pause. Then from the tree line a sudden flare of heat. An ignition. Something being abandoned or destroyed. "Damn it," the co-pilot muttered. Maggie closed her eyes for a fraction of a second, then opened them sharper than before. "Mark the location. We contain the rest." Below, the remaining figures lay flat on the ground, hands visible. Fear radiated off them in waves. "Command," Maggie said. "We have partial compliance. 1 asset escaped into tree cover. Equipment compromised." "Understood," came the reply. "State Patrol rerouting. You've prevented escalation." Prevented escalation. It sounded clean, clinical. Maggie knew better. Prevention was invisible. It never made headlines. She watched as ground units approached from the far end of the valley lights, flashing now, the night finally catching up to what had almost happened. The helicopter circled once, then began to pull back rotors, steady mission weight easing slightly from the air. In the cockpit, the pilot let out a long breath. "Nice work, ma'am." Maggie didn't answer immediately. She watched the scene below shrink, become manageable, then mundane. Another problem, absorbed by systems and reports and quiet follow-ups. "Thank you," she said finally. "All of you." The radio crackled one last time. "Collins Command wants you back at base for debrief." "Copy," Maggie replied. The helicopter turned banking toward home. Far below, the valley returned to darkness, carrying no memory of how close it had come to something worse. And in the quiet hum of the cockpit, Maggie allowed herself one slow breath, the kind that only came after the line held. Dawn crept in quietly, a thin grey light bleeding across the horizon as the helicopter settled onto the pad at the base. The rotors slowed their thunder, easing into a steady whine, then silence. Maggie stayed seated for a moment, after the engine cut hands, resting on her thighs, feeling the residual vibration hum through her bones. This was the part no one filmed, the come-down, the quiet accounting. She climbed out, and the cold hit her face, sharp and clean. Crew moved with practiced efficiency, voices low-clipped. No one congratulated anyone. There would be time for reports, for signatures, for words that turned chaos into order. For now it was enough that the sun was rising, and nothing burned behind them. Inside the debrief room, the lights were too bright. Coffee steamed in paper cups. Maps were pinned to boards, markers circling points that now meant less than they had hours ago. Colonel Harris stood at the head of the table jacket, off sleeves rolled. He nodded when Maggie entered. "Sit," he said. She did. The chair creaked under her weight. She didn't mind. They went through it step by step. Timeline, decisions, deviations. Maggie spoke plainly, her voice, even her words exact. She didn't defend herself. She didn't dramatize. She described what she saw, what she chose, what followed. When questions came, she answered them without hurry. At one point, Harris leaned back and studied her. "You took a risk?" "Yes, sir." "Calculated," he said. "Yes, sir." He nodded once. "That's why we sent you." The debrief ended without ceremony. Files closed, screens dimmed. People drifted out, already turning toward the next task. Maggie remained seated until the room emptied, then stood and stretched the stiffness from her shoulders. Outside, the base was waking. Trucks rolled, boots struck pavement, flags lifted in the early breeze. Maggie walked toward the locker room, peeled off her flight gear, and changed into civilian clothes she kept folded neatly in a bag. Jeans, a plain jacket. Nothing that announced anything. Her phone buzzed as she stepped back into the open air. She checked it. A message from Frank Miller. No questions, no panic. Proud of you. Hall's locked. Town's quiet. She stared at the screen for a moment, then typed back. Thank you. Take care. She put the phone away and headed for her car. Back in town, the morning arrived as if nothing unusual had happened. Coffee shops opened. Dogs were walked. News vans idled at intersections, reporters speaking into cameras with careful vagueness. Unconfirmed activity. Authorities investigating. No immediate threat to the public. Daniel watched one of the reports from his kitchen coffee cooling in his mug. He listened to the anchor's measured tone and thought of Maggie's voice, lower and steadier than any of it. He turned the television off and sat in silence, the quiet no longer empty. Laura scrolled through her phone on the edge of her bed, reading speculation she knew better than to share. She paused on a photo someone had posted of the reunion hall earlier that night before everything changed, faces smiling, glasses raised. She stared at it and felt a sharp pang she couldn't name. She opened a new message, typed Maggie's name, then stopped. She erased it and set the phone down. Some silences were earned. At Veterans Memorial Hall, Frank unlocked the doors again, letting sunlight spill across the scuffed floor. He moved slowly, checking corners, straightening chairs that had been left askew. He paused at the sign-in table where Maggie's name still sat in ink, clean and unmistakable. He didn't erase it. He left it there. Later that afternoon, Maggie drove back toward town, the road stretching familiar and unremarkable. She passed the exit for Ridgeway High and didn't turn. Some places were best left in memory. She stopped at a small diner instead, one she remembered from years ago. The bell over the door jingled as she entered. A waitress looked up and smiled without recognition. "Coffee," Maggie said. "Coming right up." She took a seat by the window. Outside, life moved at its ordinary pace. Inside, the coffee arrived hot and strong. Maggie wrapped her hands around the mug and let the warmth seep in. Her phone buzzed again. A different number this time. She hesitated, then answered. Maggie Frank's voice said, "I hope I'm not bothering you." "No," she replied. "You're not. I wanted to tell you," he said. Choosing his words, people are asking questions. Not about last night, about before, about who you were. Who they were. Maggie watched a car pass sunlight glinting off its windshield. "They can ask," she said. "Answers change with time." Frank chuckled softly. "You always were wiser than your years." She smiled just a little. "I had good teachers. They spoke for a few minutes more about nothing urgent, about the weather, about how the town had grown and shrunk in strange ways." When they hung up, Maggie felt lighter than she had in days. She finished her coffee and stood. As she reached the door, a man at the counter glanced at her jacket, then away, then back again. "Excuse me," he said, hesitant. "Were you last night?" Maggie met his eyes. "I was nearby." He nodded, swallowing. "Thank you." She didn't answer. She didn't need to. She pushed the door open and stepped back into the daylight. The afternoon stretched ahead, unremarkable and full of possibility. Maggie drove without hurry the road, humming beneath her tires. She thought of the valley now quiet, of the hall now empty, of the thin line that had held. By evening, the news cycle had moved on. The town settled back into itself. But something subtle remained, like a shift in gravity, barely perceptible yet undeniable. Maggie parked near her apartment and sat for a moment before getting out. The sky was streaked with orange and purple, the day folding in on itself. She breathed it in, steady and deep. 10 years ago she had walked away unseen. Last night she had returned without asking permission. Today she moved forward without needing to look back. She stepped out of the car and headed inside the door, closing softly behind her as the light faded, carrying with her the quiet knowledge that some reckonings didn't end in applause, but in clarity. The envelope waited on her kitchen table when Maggie woke the next morning. Plain white this time, no embossing, no ceremony. It had been slid through the mail slot sometime before dawn. She stood over it in bare feet, the floor cool against her skin, and felt the familiar tightening in her chest that came whenever the past reached forward uninvited. She didn't open it right away. Coffee first. The ritual mattered, the sound of water boiling, the slow pour, steam curling upward like a quiet signal to herself that the day had begun on her terms. Only then did she sit and pick up the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded once, typed, official, the kind of language that avoided emotion, because emotion complicated things. Request for voluntary testimony, State Oversight Committee, Public Safety Hearing, Civilian Infrastructure Review related to recent military coordination. Her name sat neatly at the top. They wanted her story, or at least the parts that could be said out loud. She folded the paper and set it beside her mug. Outside, a delivery truck rattled past. Somewhere down the block, a dog barked. The world continued at its usual pace, unaware that it was about to look back at itself. Across town, Daniel Harper sat in a conference room that smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and stale air. A map of the county was projected on the wall. Red circles marked locations that had meant nothing to him a week ago and now refused to leave his thoughts. "So we're saying it was contained a man in a suit," said, tapping the screen with a pen. "No damage, no injuries, minimal disruption." Daniel nodded automatically, though no one was looking at him. He wasn't here because he was needed. He was here because his firm had developed property near the corridor, and questions were being asked. "Contained doesn't mean insignificant," another voice said. Daniel thought of Maggie's words. Sometimes it's worth seeing what time changes, and what it doesn't. He cleared his throat. "If I can," he said. Heads turned. Mild surprise. There's a difference between no harm done and harm narrowly avoided, Daniel continued. His voice sounded steadier than he felt. "Last week I didn't know that difference mattered. Now I do." A few people shifted in their chairs. He didn't mention Maggie by name. He didn't need to. The weight of her absence sat in the room anyway. At Veterans Memorial Hall, Frank Miller sat at the long table beneath the flags papers spread before him. He had been asked to attend the same hearing. Not as an expert, as a witness, a bridge. He adjusted his glasses and reread his notes, though he knew them by heart. He wasn't preparing facts. He was preparing restraint, knowing when to speak, knowing when silence said more. Frank had lived long enough to understand that institutions didn't like mirrors. They preferred windows, something to look through without seeing themselves. His phone buzzed, a message from Maggie. "I got the request. I'll be there." Frank smiled faintly and typed back. "Good. You shouldn't be alone." The hearing room was larger than Maggie expected. all polished wood and microphones that made every breath sound louder than it needed to be. She took her seat without ceremony, hands folded, posture relaxed but alert. Cameras clicked softly from the back. Not a crowd. Not yet. The chairwoman called the session to order. Names were read, statements acknowledged. When Maggie's turn came, she stood. She didn't wear a uniform. She didn't wear anything remarkable at all. Jeans, a dark jacket, her hair pulled back the same way it always was. No symbols. No armor. "Lieutenant Collins," the chairwoman said. "Thank you for appearing." Maggie nodded. "Thank you for asking." The questions came carefully at first. Technical. Neutral. Maggie answered them with the same precision she brought to the cockpit. No embellishment. No deflection. Then the tone shifted. "There have been concerns," a committee member said, "about the visibility of military operations near civilian populations, the psychological impact, the message it sends." Maggie met his gaze. "With respect," she said, "the message is already there. People just don't notice it until it moves." A murmur rippled through the room. She continued, voice steady. "The infrastructure exists whether you acknowledge it or not. The risks exist whether you prepare for them or not. What happened last week didn't create danger. It revealed how close it already was." Silence followed. Not agreement. Not dissent. "Consideration." Another member leaned forward. "And your presence at a civilian gathering," he said. "Was that appropriate?" Maggie didn't hesitate. "I was invited," she said. "I showed up as myself. Nothing more." The chairwoman studied her for a moment. And when the situation escalated, "I left," Maggie replied, "because that was my responsibility." Frank watched from the side, his hands folded. He felt a familiar ache behind his eyes. Pride tempered by something heavier. Relief, maybe. That someone like her was standing there now, speaking plainly into a room that had spent decades avoiding plain truths. Daniel listened from the back, his jaw tight. He saw the woman they had once talked around, talked over, talked about. He saw how little space she took, how much gravity she carried anyway. The hearing ended without fireworks, no grand conclusions, no declarations, just the slow grind of process, shifting by a fraction of a degree. Outside, reporters waited. Maggie stepped past them without stopping. She had learned long ago the cost of answering the wrong questions. Frank caught up to her on the steps. "You did good," he said. She shrugged slightly. "I told the truth. That's what I meant." They stood there for a moment, the city moving around them. Traffic, voices, a siren far off. "Do you regret coming back?" Frank asked quietly. Maggie thought of the hall, of the valley, of the thin line that had held. "No," she said. "I needed to see where I came from, and who I wasn't anymore." Frank nodded. "That's all any of us get in the end." Across the street, Daniel hesitated, then crossed toward them. He stopped a few feet away, uncertain. "Maggie," he said. She turned, waited. "I won't pretend I understand your world," Daniel said. "But I see it now, at least a little." Maggie studied him. She saw sincerity. She saw discomfort. She saw someone recalibrating. "That's enough," she said. He exhaled, something loosening in his shoulders. "Thank you." She nodded once and turned back toward Frank. As they walked away, Daniel watched them go, aware that something had ended and something else had begun, though he couldn't name the. That evening, Maggie returned to her apartment and opened her laptop. An email waited in her inbox, flagged urgent. Not military, corporate. She frowned and opened it. The subject line was brief. Board confirmation. She read the first sentence, then the second, her expression unchanged, as understanding settled into place. The past had not just followed her back, it had been circling all along. She closed the laptop and leaned back in her chair, the city lights flickering on outside her window. The story she thought was about survival had always been about leverage, about who held it and who didn't know they did. Tomorrow, she would step into a room very different from the last one. And this time, the silence would not be hers to bear alone. The boardroom overlooked the river-glass walls, catching the pale morning light as Maggie stepped inside and closed the door behind her. The room smelled faintly of polished wood and coffee that had gone untouched. 12 seats, 11 occupied, 1 empty at the head of the table. She did not rush. Men and women in tailored suits paused their conversations as she crossed the floor. Some recognized her from news clips. Some only knew the name on the agenda. All of them felt the shift when she took the final seat, the one no one had dared to claim. The chairman cleared his throat. "Lieutenant Collins," he began. Maggie raised a hand. Calm. Controlled. "Margaret Collins," she said. "I'm here in a civilian capacity." A ripple passed through the room. Not confusion? Apprehension? The chairman nodded slowly and adjusted his glasses. Of course. As agreed, this meeting concerns confirmation of authority following last night's events and the contingency provisions enacted under emergency protocol. Maggie leaned back, slightly folding her hands on the table. Her posture was relaxed, but nothing about her was casual. Those provisions were written for moments exactly like this, she said. Moments when silence becomes liability. One of the board members shifted in his seat. With respect, he said, this company has operated independently of military oversight. Until it didn't, Maggie replied. Her voice was level, unyielding. Until your infrastructure intersected with national security corridors you claimed not to know existed. Ignorance doesn't dissolve responsibility. Another member spoke up sharper. You're asking us to accept civilian leadership from someone with no corporate background. Maggie's gaze moved to him, steady as a sight line. No, she said. I'm asking you to acknowledge reality. This corporation was built on systems that assumed protection without understanding cost. Last night exposed that assumption. The question isn't whether I belong here, it's whether this board does. Silence followed. Heavy. Absolute. At the far end of the table, a woman with silver hair and eyes that missed nothing finally spoke. We confirmed the trust documents at dawn, she said. They're valid. The founder's shares transferred as stipulated. Majority control is hers. Several heads turned sharply toward Maggie. She didn't react. She had known before she walked in. The email had made that clear. What mattered was not surprise. It was acceptance. The chairman exhaled slowly. Margaret Collins, he said the words, tasting unfamiliar by unanimous clause, you are now acting Chief Executive Officer, pending formal ratification. Maggie nodded once. No smile, no victory, just acknowledgement. Effective immediately, she said, this company will halt all operations along unsecured corridors. We will cooperate fully with oversight agencies, not because we are compelled, but because we are accountable. Any objection can be filed in writing. No one objected. Outside the building, cameras waited. Maggie did not stop for them. She exited through a side door and walked alone toward the river, the city rising and settling around her like breath. She felt the weight of what had shifted, not as triumph, but as gravity. Power was not a crown. It was a load. Her phone buzzed. Frank's name. It's done, she said before he could speak. He laughed softly. I figured. The town's buzzing. Let them buzz, Maggie replied. Noise fades. And you, Frank said. How do you feel? Maggie watched the water move, steady and indifferent. Clear, she said. For the first time, they said goodbye without ceremony. Across town, Daniel stood in his office and stared at the skyline. News alerts pinged his phone, but he didn't open them. He already knew the headline would carry a version of Maggie he recognized now and wished he had seen earlier. Not a myth. Not a spectacle. A presence. Laura sat at her kitchen table with the same old photos spread out before her. She picked one up, Maggie at 16, half turned away, and set it down gently. The past didn't change, but how you held it could. At Veterans Memorial Hall, Frank replaced the banner with a flag and locked the doors. He stood for a moment in the quiet and smiled to himself. The line had held. That evening, Maggie returned to her apartment and opened the window. The city breathed in, breathed out. She sat at the small table where the reunion invitation had once rested and placed a new folder there instead. Plans, policies, names that would need calling, work that would not wait. She did not feel vindicated. She felt responsible. Somewhere far from the city, the valley lay quiet, unremarkable, carrying no scars anyone would notice. That was the point. Prevention left no monuments. Maggie closed the folder and leaned back, the day finally catching up to her. She allowed herself one slow breath, then another. Tomorrow would bring resistance, doubt, attempts to minimize what had been revealed. She was ready for all of it. Quiet people always were. If this story stayed with you, if it made you think about the weight carried by those we overlook, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and comment 3 simple words below. Quiet people matter.